transport. And so let's do the definition thing first. This is now movement of a substance from low to high concentration. So we're moving a substance from low to high concentration, and again, it's across a semi-permeable membrane because all we care about is moving it in and out of the cell. So movement of a substance from low to high concentration across the semi-permeable membrane, and ATP is needed. We're going to have a little bit of ATP going on here. All right, so let's talk about primary active transport first. Now before we start, let me just tell you one other thing. I told you that these integral proteins in the cell membrane can be called a gate or a channel or a pore. But we only call them a gate or a channel or a pore if we're talking about passive transport. So any of the types of diffusion. We're using a gate or a channel or a pore. But with active transport, we're now going to call these integral proteins a pump. Okay? So with passive transport, we have a gate or a channel or a pore. With active transport, we're going to call our integral protein a pump. Okay, now in this pump, there are regions where certain chemicals are going to be able to bond. These regions where certain chemicals bond are what we're going to refer to as a binding site. So one of the pumps that we're going to talk about now is going to actively transport sodium. So let's say that we have a very high concentration of sodium on this side of the membrane. Lots and lots of sodium ions floating around. And we can say this is our extracellular fluid, this is our intracellular fluid, and we don't have as much sodium here. Okay? So much higher concentration on the outside of the cell, much lower concentration on the inside of the cell. And these binding sites have a very high affinity for only sodium. Nothing else can bond there. They attract or have that affinity for sodium. So we can also say they have a very high specificity. So only sodium is attracted into this bonding site. So we're going to move sodium 3 at a time into our binding site. Now also and always on every single integral protein pump, we also have another protein attached. This protein happens to be an enzyme that we call ATPase. This is always attached to every single integral protein pump, this ATPase enzyme. So we have first all of the sodium being attracted into the binding site. The next thing that we see is that our ATPase enzyme is going to take an ATP molecule and break it down into ADP and a phosphate. first our 3 sodium are attracted into their bonding site, and then the ATP molecule is broken down. We pull a phosphate off and we have ADP and a free phosphate. Remember, we use phosphates from ATP to change the shape of proteins. Those phosphates, when they attach to the protein, will break hydrogen bonds and cause the protein to change shape, and that's what's going to happen. This phosphate here is going to come back and bond to our protein pump. This is what changes the shape of this protein pump, and it pushes our 3 sodium into the extracellular fluid where it's a higher concentration. It's crowded in there. These sodium literally have to be pushed or forced across into the higher concentration crowded region. And we just moved 3 sodium from low concentration, to high concentration. We just pushed them across what we would say against the concentration gradient. The concentration gradient is considered high to low, and we just went against that gradient from low to high. Okay, so one more time. These binding sites have a very high affinity, very high specificity for just sodium, and 3 sodium can come in and bond. Immediately our ATPase enzyme pulls a phosphate off of the ATP, and that phosphate comes and binds to our pump, activates the pump, changes the shape of the pump so that the pump push those 3 sodium across into the more concentrated region. Any questions about that so far?
How come in the other one?
With facilitated?
No, I guess it wasn't facilitated. They turned the ATP into A or CA.
Oh,
What's the
I'm sorry,
difference?
that's a denylate cyclase. That's a different enzyme. It has a different job.
So would this be more, I guess, would there be more of these than the other one?
More
On a cell?
ATPase?
Yeah,
Oh, yeah,
okay.
absolutely.
So this is the more common reaction.
Yes, but making cyclic AMP is made in every single cell all the time too. So it's fairly common, but yes, this is much more common. Yes. And this pump we're talking about now is the most used pump in the body. Every single cell has lots of these.
This is sodium potassium pump?
This is sodium. Okay, so now our 3 sodium have been transported across low concentration to high. Now this pump can do double duty. It can not only transport sodium, but it can also transport potassium in the opposite direction. So if our potassium is in lower concentration in the extracellular fluid, but much higher concentration in the intracellular fluid, we're going to have potassium entering in this direction into the binding site. Now you don't need another phosphate. You can still use the same phosphate that's already attached. And what the phosphate is going to do is once these potassium bind, it'll push the potassium in the opposite direction. And again, our potassium are moving from low to high concentration. Now, the important thing for you to notice also, we call this type of pump a primary active transport pump. And the reason it's called primary is because you can only move one kind of chemical at a time. So we moved sodium first when we were done with that, then we moved potassium. But we only moved one type of chemical at a time, and that would be primary active transport. The difference between primary and secondary is just this. You can move in secondary 2 types of chemicals at the same time. Okay? So now, let's take a look at it. Let's say that this is our pump, okay? and it has binding sites in it. And remember, always, always on our pump, we also have attached our ATPase enzyme. Okay? So in this case, let's say our pump attracts in a hydrogen ion, and at the same time, it attracts in a potassium ion. So there are two different kinds of chemicals that we're going to move at the same time. So now, of course, we know that ATPase will then take our ATP molecule and break it down into ADP and the phosphate that we're going to use to change the shape of the pump. This phosphate is going to bind to our pump and create a shape change so that we push both of the hydrogen and the potassium through the membrane, low concentration to high, doing it both at the same time. So this would be considered a secondary active transport pump. So basically, same type of thing has happened with primary, just we push sodium first and then potassium second. Okay, let's try one more. Let's say that you have this type of pump here, and you have two binding sites again. But this time, you're going to bring hydrogen in, and in the opposite direction, you're going to bring a chloride ion in. So they're not coming in the same direction, they're doing the opposite thing. Same thing again, we always have an ATPase enzyme going on here. And as soon as our hydrogen and our chloride bind, we're going to break our ATP apart into ADP plus our usable phosphate, which is going to change the shape of this pump. But this time, we're going to pump them both at the same time, just in opposite directions. So the hydrogen is going one way, and the chloride is going in the opposite direction. Now this type of pump is also still secondary active transport because again, we're moving two different types of chemicals at the same time. Now, doesn't matter if it's primary, doesn't matter if it's secondary. If you're moving chemicals in the same direction, we would call this symport. If you're moving them in opposite directions, we would call this antiport. So in our very first pump we talked about, the primary active transport pump with sodium and potassium, is this a symport or an antiport? Antiport. Sodium went in one direction, potassium went in the opposite, so it would be antiport. Even if they didn't go at the same time, we're just looking at what direction they went in. Any questions about these pumps? Now, by the way, if you want to name a pump, you just use whatever chemical they're moving. So this pump would be a sodium potassium pump, but for whatever reason, even though every single pump has it, you always say it's an ATPase pump. So this will be a sodium potassium ATPase pump. This one would be a hydrogen potassium ATPase pump. What would this one be? Hydrogen chloride ATPase pump. Seems kind of silly to me that they always put ATPase because it's on every single pump anyway, but that's how we label it, just so that you know. Okay, so one more type of transport I want to talk to you about. It's called vesicular transport. Okay? transport, you have two types of mechanisms. One is called endocytosis, and the second is called exocytosis. So we're going to talk about both endo and exo, and under endocytosis, there's three ways to move things. And endocytosis means that we're moving it into the cell, in comparison to exo, which would be out of the cell. Now, I do want to also tell you, these are a kind of an active transport, because you do need a lot of energy to get this stuff moving, okay? So let's talk about endocytosis first. The reason we move this, or use this kind of transport, I should say, for movement, is because we're moving really large molecules or large amounts of molecules across the cell. So it's not like a couple ions here or there. We're going to move big things or big amounts across the cell. So the first type of endocytosis is what we would call phagocytosis. Now, phagocytosis can only be used by immune cells. This is stuff that's happening only in our immune system. And the kind of cells that go through phagocytosis we call either phagocytes or macrophage. Okay, so this is showing you how phagocytes are able to consume bad guys that get into the cell, or get into our body. So we're looking at trying to kill bacteria, viruses, whatever shouldn't be inside the body. So these are the macrophage, and what they're able to do is extend these arms out and grab a hold of certain substances and then pull those back in to the macrophage and destroy them. Okay, so this is a kind of endocytosis. Okay, very simple. Now let's talk about how this actually works. So inside these specialized phagocytes, or inside these macrophage, are these little water jets, these little pumps that can move water around. And so as soon as these phagocytes come across an enemy, okay, a bacteria, virus, a piece of dust, anything that shouldn't be in the body, maybe you inhaled something wrong, what's going to happen is these little water jets turn on. And it causes the water that's inside the phagocytes to start streaming towards the cell membrane. And you can see this under a microscope. You can see the little water coming from the center of the cell going out towards the cell membrane. And so what it does is it causes these arms to protrude. And as the arms protrude, they grab a hold of whatever it is that they want to eat. And then the little water jets turn on backward and help to pull those arms back in. And now they're also pulling this bacteria, let's say, back into the cell, where the cell is able to destroy it. So in this overhead, you can see these are the little arms right here, what they call pseudopods. That means false arms. And they're going to go around this piece of dirt or bacteria, whatever, and surround it. Now, eventually, these arms are going to fuse. And you can see that this piece of dust is surrounded with cell membrane. Now, actually, it's not just a little loop of cell membrane. What they've done is they've cut it in half so you can see inside. This is like a cell membrane basketball, okay? So it looks like a basketball all the way around the outside of it with this piece of bacteria, let's say, inside of it. So the arms surround it and pull it in, and we put it in this phospholipid bilayer basketball-like structure, which I want you to know is referred to as a vesicle. So anytime we surround something with this phospholipid bilayer, round basketball-like structure, we've put it into a vesicle. And once it gets into that vesicle, now our phagocyte is able to destroy it, kill it, get rid of it. The next type of endocytosis is something we refer to as pinocytosis. Now, it's really interesting because some people will refer to phagocytosis as cellular eating and pinocytosis as cellular drinking. And really, phagocytosis and pinocytosis in the Latin means eating and drinking. So with pinocytosis, what's going to happen now is the cell, and this could be pretty much any cell in your body, is able to turn on, again, these little water jets, which start to stream water from the cell membrane towards the center of the cell. And as the water starts moving towards the center, it's kind of sucking in the cell membrane with it. It's causing the cell membrane to fold inward. And as that cell membrane starts to fold inward, it begins to pull certain chemicals in with it. Now, it's not particular, it's not picky about which chemicals get sucked in. And this is almost kind of like, if you're sucking on a straw, you're going to pull these chemicals in. It's sort of what the cell is doing. The cell does this if it needs a whole bunch of chemicals at one time to come inside so it can do whatever its cellular mechanisms are at the time. So we're going to drink in or suck in a bunch of chemicals all at one time. And again, notice that the cell membrane is going to fuse and pinch off, and we're going to have all these chemicals inside a vesicle again. And eventually the cell will tear down the vesicle and just use all those chemicals for whatever process it needs. The next type of endocytosis is called receptor-mediated endocytosis. Okay, so I got to show you a couple things before we go into this. So if we have a cell, all right, and in the cell membrane you have an integral protein. And attached to that integral protein is glycogen. You know that we refer to this as a glycoprotein. Now, this integral protein, let's say it's a type of protein that can open up and become a gate, and some kind of chemical is able to go through this. So let's say it's a gate that if insulin binds to it, it will open up, and then glucose is able to travel through this gate. This entire complex, the integral protein gate with the glycogen, is something that is typically referred to as a receptor. Because something can bind to it, we receive information, it opens up, we get stuff going. Now, if I want to be lazy, I can draw the whole receptor complex just like that. And so if you see something drawn with a little Y on the outside, call that a receptor too. But really it stands for this integral protein gate with the glycogen, and it opens and all that kind of good stuff. But this is also referred to as a receptor. So if you look at our picture,